All right, we're recording to the cloud. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Deland. I'm one of the directors with the Ottawa Valley Watch and Clock Collectors Club. Thank you for joining us today. And this afternoon, we have Wendell Feener, a distinguished member of our club, who's going to take us through some Atmos training effectively for this week and a similar session next week. And I'll let Wendell, sorry, I'll let Wendell explain the details of what he's going to be doing in the two sessions. We ask you that you mute yourself so that we don't pick up all the background noise. And if you need to ask a question at some point, then simply unmute and then ask your question. Go ahead, Wendell.
Yeah, I'm dealing with 3 cameras, so just be patient. It may take me a while to maneuver around. I'm doing this myself. So just a little introduction of myself. I've been collecting and working on clocks for about 30 years. And during that collection process, I acquired 3 Atmos clocks. One of them worked and 2 of them didn't. So I decided I wanted to service Atmos clocks, at least service my own. But there's not very much information out there. So it started a year or 2 process of gathering information. So that's how this started. So it's going to be a 2-step process because there's a lot of little things you need to understand about Atmos clocks, and we're going to cover them in the first session. So it will take up to 2 hours. And in the second session, we'll actually be taking the clock apart and doing a basic service on it. But it's important to know all the theory on now, a lot of this information is stuff I acquired from various sources. And it all seemed to work for me. So that's about the best I can offer of its credibility. Indications are that an Atmos clock, a service should last up to 20 years. Most people don't touch them until they stop. Today's clock is going to be a 528 from the 1970s. I'll be showing that clock here shortly. Now, the references, I'll try to give you a quick list of all the references. Now, I got to share a camera here. Okay, as I said, it took me over a year trying to find information on most people won't touch an Atmos clock, and anybody that has any information on it doesn't seem to want to share it. Now, I ended up buying a book. That book has a fair amount of information on it. A lot of the charts and whatnot are in there, and we're going to talk about this chart. So about 1/3 of that book covers Atmos clocks. And then these Lickholter repair notes. These notes really don't tell you how to repair a clock, but they do show you all the technical, there's a lot of technical information, but it's not like a play-by-play. For instance, here they show all the little measurements that you need to know about. They have parts listings. So I actually bought, through my process, there was a guy on eBay selling, I bought a CD with a lot of that stuff in it, but all these notes, the 3 different types of notes, they're all included in that book. I got the book on Amazon. It runs around $50. So, and I had a bunch of old VCR videos I looked at. And there's some other little short snippets of information on Atmos clocks on YouTube that one that I found that helped me, because if you have to replace a suspension spring, today they don't come with the ends on them, so you have to use your old ends. And I found a video, and a guy showed a way to do that, so I found that helpful. So anyway, so I achieved enough information to attempt to work on them. And I broke the first suspension spring on the first clock I worked at. So one of the things about working on Atmos clocks, they're in a lot of ways quite simple, but they're very, very unforgiving. Damage is easily caused, and in some cases, it's very expensive damage. So now as I've been doing research, every little tidbit that I found, I put in a whole bunch of notes. And that's kind of what we're going to go through today. All the different settings and hints and whatnot. Now, the next thing that you need to have, unfortunately, like everything, there's a special set of tools. Now, all these wires, they're my measurement tools. Now, here's a holder, which you definitely need. This kit that I got, and this tool here is used for bending the pendulum tube to poise it. This is a tool that I made for adjusting the crown nut, and these are some spacers and wrenches. So that whole kit I bought at Time Savers. By the time you get it here in Canada, you're looking at about $400. But you can buy certain pieces individually. We'll be using some of those tools as we go by, as we progress through. So this is a page that came with the tools that describes what each one does. And now also at Time Savers, you can buy weights. We're going to get into this a little. This is what one of the weights look like. And they come in different thicknesses. And we're going to get into that fairly heavy here in a few minutes. But you can get those at Time Savers also. They're not 100% perfect match, but you can't see them. They're underneath, so it really doesn't matter. Or it didn't matter to me. And these are suspension springs. They come in a tube. You can't really see it. The suspension spring in these clocks are 0.02 of an inch thick and 0.10 of an inch wide. That's why they're so delicate. Perrins retail them. It's where I found them. The other thing that you need to get is some Kim wipes. These are a lint-free wipe. I use them for working on clocks. I got them on Amazon. I bought a big box. I think it came with 30 boxes of them. There's 286 wipes. They're a fairly good size. But it's important to have something that's lint-free because these clocks are very, very delicate. And the other thing that you need to do when you're handling the clock is wear gloves. You can wear cotton ones, but I wear these latex anytime I'm handling the clock because they're gold-plated and it doesn't take much for it to corrode. Now, I'm of the opinion that if you understand and are capable of working on a platform balance in a ship's clock or something like that, or a pocket watch, if you understand and are able to deal with the delicacy of that, And with this information, you should be able to service an Atmos clock, at least a 526 or a 528. The 540 came out, it's the latest model, I believe, I think around 84, and it's quite a bit different. So some of the things will apply and some of them won't. So I guess what we're going to do, we're going to get into the theory. So first thing I got to do is put my gloves on. Okay, that's a top view. Now I'm going to give you another view of this clock. I'm using an iPad. I'm going to share the screen from an iPad, and it seems to work. Just let me. It's loading up here now. Just take a second for the Wi-Fi to kick in. Okay. That's the front of the clock. And at the same time, I've got the overhead view for you to I don't have a proper stand for my iPad, but I'll try to work something out for a future date. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we're going to take the glass off of so that we can get in close and see things. We need to take the glass off. Now, on this particular clock, there's 4 screws, and it's very important to use the proper screwdriver for working on these clocks. Because you don't want to damage them, because an Atmos clock is all about looks. So you don't want any scarring or damaging on anything. Now, on this particular clock, the 528, it has I call it plexiglass, but I think technically it's a lucite. The top piece is a lucite and the rest are all glass. Now, I've had this off a number of times, so you have to be careful when you're lifting. So the first thing to do is take the door off, and there's a piece in the front, and that just slips out. Now the top, now in the front here, there's a heavy bar, and be careful when you're lifting that up, because the most delicate part on these clocks is the minute arbor where the hand fits on. All the pivots run in jewels on these clocks, and they're glass hard, and they break very easily. There's very few for sale. So when you lift that up, you'll notice there's a heavy, see the heavy bar? So just be careful that that doesn't fall down and damage the hands. So this piece lifts off, and then the plexiglass piece comes off. And then I'll take the back glass off. Now, these sides, when I first took this clock apart, there's a rubber you'll see and top and bottom, and they were actually stuck. And I had a heck of a job getting them out, but they're not glued in. It's just that the rubber gets soft over time. So now we have all the glass off of it. So we can look around, and here's your canister. So I'm just following my notes here that I made so we don't miss anything. Now, there's three things that we're not going to do to this clock just simply because of time. The one thing we're not going to do is we're not going to replace. Let me zoom in there. You can see the suspension spring on the top. See how small it is. We won't be replacing that, but we are going to take it out of the frame, but we won't be taking it out of the tube. The bad part about that is that if you don't take it out of the tube, you can't inspect it. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we're not going to replace that spring. And the actual movement itself, we're not going to take apart, but we are going to take the escapement bridge off. It's a separate bridge, so I can show you how to poise that. The rest of the movement is pretty basic, but I want to show you how to poise because these clocks have so little power. Even the hour hand has to be balanced, and the minute hand, everything has to be perfectly balanced. And the other thing that we won't be doing, it's on this side. The spring is inside this. We won't be taking the spring out, but you'll get the gist of what we're going to do. Now, the other thing that's interesting about these clocks, everybody calls this piece down here a pendulum. Technically, it's the balance wheel of the clock, just like in a pocket watch, but everybody calls it a pendulum. So I'm like everybody else, I call it a pendulum too. So what we're going to do now is we're going to assess. Now, it's important. I have to get a pointer. So it's important. One of the things that you can do if you go to buy an Atmos clock, because inside this canister is a piece. This is an old Bellows, and they come all because there's a gas in them. Now, this one is bad. I had to replace a bellows in one of mine. So this bellows is collapsed. You can see everything is tight. There's a chemical inside that, and later on in my notes, I'll tell you exactly what that chemical is. I forget. But this is collapsed. And when we're looking at this clock, there's a chain that goes through. So if you look at these 528s and all you can see is chain top and bottom, you have some comfort and a reasonable chance that the bellows is still good. And I'll show you exactly why you can make that assumption. So the next thing we want to do is take that canister off. So to do that, we need to lay the clock on its back, and I have a couple spaces here that comes in the kit, because what we're going to do is we're going to lay it on its back, and we're going to put them there. So normally I do this on foam, and I can do this because the pendulum is locked. You don't do anything to this clock. You don't set the time, you don't move it, you don't do anything unless the pendulum is locked. So there's one nut in here. This particular one has two nuts holding the so you have to be very careful. You don't want to scratch anything. If I use a pair of tweezers, I have a pair of fiber end tweezers, so I use them because they won't scratch. Now that canister is on there; it's spring loaded, but not a very powerful spring. But still, be aware that. So I've got the crown nut. So we're going to rotate that around because there's another one on the other side. This is pretty straightforward, so this is the only thing we're taking apart today. Everything else, we're gonna wait for another week. I can show you what you can see the other nut where I'm working here. Okay, so that nut come off. Okay, so now when you're picking this up, make sure your hand is under that canister, holding it. You want to hold it in place. So I'm going to slowly move it straight back. So you can see the coil spring here, and there's certain measurements that we have to do with that stuff. So let's set that aside. I have to get my metric. Get my metric ruler. Okay, so this canister, if you look inside, you'll see a very large, heavy spring. That's the resistance pushing against, and this is the canister bellows. Now, there's some neat YouTube videos. If you put an ice cube on that, that will shrink down, because this clock only works between 46 Fahrenheit and 86 Fahrenheit. So that's how you take, because this top is a bayonet mount, and you need to take the pressure off of it to take it out. So what we need to do is measure the depth of that clock. And it's showing about 24 millimeters. Now, if we look, I forgot what's this. Where is my notes on the bellows? Oh, when you want to find something, you can't. Where did I put? It should be in my notes. Oh. This is live TV. I guess that's why they have editing. Clock, centering, position, roll. .22 millimeters at 70 degrees. So you have to be careful when you're doing this test. If you're in a really cold room, you're going to get a different measurement. But at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, that should measure 22 millimeters, which tells you that that bellows is good. Now, if it measures 41 millimeters, because you can see this, it's collapsed down. So the depth then would be deeper. So if it measures 41 millimeters, then you know that all the gases because the gas that's in there, it's ethyl chloride, and it's a gas that boils at 54 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's why it's always a gas inside this chamber, inside a house, because most people have their house warm at 54 degrees Fahrenheit. So that passed. So this passed the test of being good. So I'm going to set that aside. I'm trying to work on a small desk and I don't have a lot of room. Okay, so we talked about the bellows, how the bellows works. Now, an interesting thing about these clocks, if you found one, because you can manually wind this clock by pumping this up, which you have to do, and we're going to do during the service part. So you don't need that canister on the back to run this clock. Now, a couple interesting things. When I was looking for a new bellows, luckily I found one locally. A friend of mine had it, and I got it really cheap. But a new bellows can cost you between $500 and $700. So you need to take that into consideration if you're buying an Atmos clock, if the bellows is no good. But if you look at the chain and you don't see any spring, which we'll cover when we let down the spring on this clock later. But now there is people that will repair these bellows, but they only give a 6-month warranty. And if the clock is wound up fully, it will run for a year without the bellows on it. So you can manually wind the clock yourself if you found one until you found a good replacement for a bellows. So you don't need the canister and the bellows on the back to actually run this clock. Okay, so now we're going to talk about torsion, because this clock is a torsion clock. Yeah, because what you're doing is torquing the suspension spring to actually make it work. And I want to show you another torsion clock.
He's not going to do a suspension spring. He's not going to change the main spring. Don't you have to do it?
Okay, here's another. This is another torsion clock.
Take the main spring out.
Are you on mute?
Hey?
Are you on mute?
I don't know. Doesn't say.
Yeah, there's somebody talking there in the background. Okay, so we're going to talk about torsion clocks. Now, if you look, this is a 400-day clock, and you notice it's hanging on a suspension spring, and the suspension spring is a fixed length, identical. See if I can get both of these in the same picture. See, both of these have a suspension spring, and it's fixed length. Because when you're talking about torsion clocks, there's 4 ways that you can regulate them. And a 400-day clock uses 2 of those ways, and an Atmos clock uses the 2 other ways. Now, if we look at how this, okay, so I can use a mouse here. So if you watch the screen, okay, so here I'm pointing with a mouse. So here's the suspension spring, and we have the pendulum that's swinging wildly. And let me load that up. Okay, so here's your escape wheel, and here's your escapement. Now, on these 400-day clocks, if I rotate that a little bit, you'll notice there's always a pin that's mounted to the arbor that holds the escapement. So what that pin is doing, it's driving a piece this piece here has a notch in it. So the escapement is directly torquing that flat suspension spring, giving it enough power to keep the clock running. And so that's all driven from the escape wheel up through the spring barrel and whatnot. So if we look at an Atmos clock, it's doing a lot of the same. So we have, so down in here, we have the escape wheel and we have the escapement. So instead of the pin like in the 400-day clock, it has an arm that comes up and it has a Y, and that Y pushes on that roller, and the roller is clamped to the tube that's actually clamped down to the pendulum. So they're kind of doing exactly the same thing, except in a 400-day clock, it's torquing the spring, it's directly, and in the Atmos clock, it's actually torquing the pendulum. Now, what are the 4 ways that you can regulate a torsion clock? One thing that we do is we change, grab my parts. Now you've probably all seen these. They're the rollover springs, and you notice these come in different thicknesses. And the thicker the suspension spring, the faster the clock will run. But we can do that in the 400-day clock. We can change that spring, but in an Atmos clock, they only provide the one spring. It's 2,000 thick. So the change in the spring is used in a 400-day clock. Now, in an Atmos clock, what we do, if we change I use the word effective because we're not changing the overall physical length of the suspension spring, we're changing the effective length. And if we look, it's hard to get right up at the very top. I had a bunch of hands. If we look right here, you'll see a little black thing. That's the regulator. And through that whole mechanism on the top, what you're doing is sliding that up and down. Now, you're going to see that in great deal once we take the clock apart. So what we're doing when we slide the arm up here in the top, this arm, we're actually sliding that up and down the suspension spring. So in effect, we're changing the length of that suspension spring, because that regulator, and that's what they call it, trying to look for the, okay, so if we get, if we look right in here, there's a screw, and that screw locks that whole mechanism on the regulator. So when we turn the lever on the top, that regulator pin slides up and down the suspension spring. Now, there's some technical information you need to know about how tight that regulator pin has to be on the suspension spring. It has to lift. I think it was 30 grams or something, but all that high technical stuff is in if you look at these notes, right? All the high technical stuff is in that. So that's number 2. So the Atmos clock changes. So the shorter, so if we slide that regulator down, making the effective length of that suspension spring shorter, we're actually speeding up the clock. So short is fast. Now, the mass of the pendulum. Now, inside this pendulum, If I was a monkey and had 4 hands and I could use my tail, this would work good. Get my pointer. So inside this pendulum, you can see it's hollow. There's actually weights. I showed you a weight earlier. I'll show you one again. This weight, and the reason it's curved because the pendulum is curved, and there's a hole, and there's a screw goes up inside that actually changes. So we use that in the Atmos clock. So we actually change the mass of the pendulum. So the heavier the pendulum, it's going to slow down the time. So the last way we regulate a torsion clock, if we look at this one, you'll notice there's 2 weights and a threaded rod. So what you're doing is you're moving the mass further out or further in, and you can compare that to a figure skater. When they pull their arms in tight against their body, they speed up. And the same thing happens in that. Or another one that you can look at is when you turn this screw, you're actually moving the balls. They go in and out. So those are the 4 ways that you regulate a torsion clock. So in the Atmos clock, we're going to slide the regulator up and down the spring to make it shorter or longer, depending whether we want to increase or decrease the time. And we're going to change the mass of the pendulum. Changing the mass of the pendulum is a very, very sloppy way of, because if you change the suspension spring, you don't know how far the time is out till you put it all together. And then you got to check it. And if it's out too far for the regulator up on top to adjust, then you got to take it all apart, take the pendulum out, and change the weights. Now, there's formulas for doing that, which we'll get into. Okay, so that I'm going to move this clock out of my way. Okay, so the quick theory on how an Atmos clock works is, so an Atmos clock is like a torsion clock, like an anniversary clock, very, very comparable. The movement is spring driven. There's a spring inside. Well, actually, I can point. The spring is inside here, and this is the spring barrel. The unique feature about an Atmos clock is that it's automatically wound for you. Some people refer to it as a perpetual motion clock, because this spring, this is being pumped up and down, and it's pulling the ratchet. Okay, so if we look here, these are the ratchet teeth, and there's the ratchet barrel. So as this chain here is pulled in and out, because if we look, you can see where the chain is fastened here. And again, there's measurements that we'll go through as we're doing it. So it's automatically, and the reason that's a very controlled thing, because if this clock is overwound, it won't run. It's designed to run at a certain tension. So the clock is automatically wound. And that's done by the gas-filled chamber on the back that expands and contracts. But this clock will only work between 46 degrees Fahrenheit and 86 degrees Fahrenheit. At 50, I think it was 54 degrees, that chemical turns into a gas. And and this clock has two escapements. It has the escape wheel. Oh, we can see, yeah. Okay, you could, right here, you can see the bottom of the escape wheel, and here's the, we'll take advantage of the magnification. You can see the pallets here, and this is your escapement arbor, and you see this, and this piece it's aluminum, very light, and it's attached to the escapement arbor, and it has two legs, one up and down. And to poise that, you have to bend those legs, and that piece goes up. You can see the piece coming up, and now the roller, if I let that unlock, I'm going to unlock that. Okay, so it overbanked. So you'll actually see it go around. Now you can actually see the fork here. It's not very level. So can you see it come in the roller? So this fork here is what's given the kick to that wheel to actually run the clock. And you see how the inside of that fork is polished? All this mechanism all has to be perfect and clean, and there's adjustments to set it up. They actually sound worse than what they are, but there's a logical method to it. So that's how the Atmos clock works. So it's kind of a two-part escapement. The escape wheel regulates the time, and it comes up and forces and gives a little kick on the roller. So to actually adjust the time on this clock, we the course time is done by weights on the balance, and the fine time is done up on the top with the regulation arm. And each division on that regulation arm is 10 seconds a day. Now, you'll hear those numbers a lot as we go through. So that's kind of the theory behind how all that works. I can open it up if anybody's got any questions on what we discussed so far. We don't want to get into a lot of time with questions, but if there's something that wasn't super clear, best time is to ask it now while we have the clock, because we're going to go over all the technical measurements and stuff like that, what they do in the next phase. So does anybody have a question, something that wasn't real clear that I can answer right now?
Sure, I have one question, Wendell. This is Blair here. I'm just wondering, once the clock was assembled at the factory and timed, I would assume you don't have to change the weights in the pendulum after that.
Correct. Unless you change that suspension spring, there's enough regulation in the time up top. That's all set.
Okay.
And we're going to go through what we're going to go through now. We're going to go through some tests and some logic in whether or not you have to take the suspension spring out to inspect it, which is a risky thing. I think they run around $40 each. And then it's a big process. And I know because I did it, I've changed suspension springs. It's a big process to time it. Not a super hard process, but it is a time consuming. I think that's why people charge so much to service these clocks, because it takes a long time to time them. But we're going to go through that in great detail.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thanks, Wendell.
Okay. Anybody else have anything quickly? I guess not. Okay. So there's 4 or 5 tests I like to do, and I've categorized these tests in my notes. Some are running, some you do during service, some you do after service, some you do with the pendulum locked. But right now, the first group that we're going to talk about is things that will help you decide whether the suspension spring needs further investigation. So that's what we're going to do now. So the first one that we're going to talk about is that what I like to do, if the clock is still running, and usually the clock will run and it will start slowing down, the pendulum rotations will start slowing down, and that gives you an indication that it's starting to get dirty and it needs to be serviced. So I like to verify that the clock is keeping good time before I start. Now, if it's your own clock, you already would know that. But if you're purchasing a clock, you don't know anything about it. So I like to run it for 24 hours and kind of find out roughly using the minute hand how far out of time my Zoom kicked out. I don't know whether that's
Is that the Zoom on your camera or your Zoom meeting?
my iPad screen sharing died. It probably timed out.
Yeah.
Let me stop the sharing and quickly do that again. If I had I need a producer here, a camera operator, to keep me on the straight and narrow. Okay. So that's the first thing that I like to do, is create some history in the clock and how good a timekeeping is it. If it's within a minute or two in 24 hours, that's okay. Now, the other thing to note about these clocks, if you do any adjustments, you have to let the thing sit for 24 hours before you do any more evaluation. It takes a long time for these clocks to respond to time adjustments. So you have to wait. So there's another test we do called the 15-minute test. And you do that after you've changed the suspension spring and all that. So it's nice to have these comparisons. Now, if you've changed the suspension spring, well, then it's a whole different story. Okay, so the other thing that we like to do is I'm going to slow that down because that baby is moving it around. Okay, so what we do, these pieces here, I call these motifs. So you can count how many of those pass from start to finish. Now, in this particular clock, that pendulum should rotate 540 degrees. So I don't know where it's at now. The clock hasn't been settled. I've been locking and unlocking, and that changes everything. So for this particular clock, 18 of those as they pass gives you 540 degrees. There's 12 of those motifs, and they're at 30-degree spacing. So this clock should be between 17 and 19 of those motifs if it's in good running order. I notice my screen is jumping. My internet must be not quite stable.
We look pretty good over here.
Yeah, I just say I noticed the pendulum jumping here. Now that could be.
Yeah, I see that.
that could be the connection, the Wi-Fi between my iPad and my laptop. It's going through a whole bunch of connections. So anyways, so you count those motives and that gives you an indication. So when you service it, let's say it had 18 and after 5 years or 10 years, it was down to only doing 15. Well, then you know that it's starting to, something's taking away some energy. And in these clocks, it's usually a little bit of dirt because these clocks run dry. The pivots are glass hard, perfectly polished, and they're all jewel set. So there should be zero friction. Now, the other thing that I got to try to show you is the next thing that I like to do is to check. Maybe the clock doesn't run real good. I want to check, see how much power and the kick is going to those rollers. How do I do that? It's in a place where you can't see. Mm-hmm. I'll have to explain it to you, I guess, because this thing is using a couple different lenses and I can't get them all in. But when that roller comes around, you'll notice the escape wheel, that lever has to push it out. And I'm going to gently turn this sideways. So the direction that that's traveling, you'll actually see it as the roller goes in the forks. Let me blow that up a bit. So as the roller went into forks, it's gonna actually be pushing this one going that direction, but then partway through, the other side should snap over as the escape wheel tooth clicks, and it should actually push the roller out. Okay, so now the roller's coming back because there has to be clearance between this fork. So it's actually now pushing on the other one, and now all of a sudden this side here should push the roller out, and that's where it gets its power from. So when you're looking down inside, if I had the face off, and I may do that with the face off, but I got to take the hands and do all that stuff off to show that. But that's a test that I like to look to see how much snap, and I do that in clocks too, to see how much kick is coming out of the escape wheel. So that arm should give it a good kick and move from one side to the other one. I had one time that there was no power getting to the escape wheel, and it just kind of flopped. Because if you have that clock, that pendulum spinning, it will run for an hour or two just by itself with no kick. So that's an important little test to note to see how well things are working. Now, I gotta lock this game. And I always lock it when the roller, as you can see, the roller is not in the forks. They tell you if you're going to move it or you're going to set the time, wait until it gets extended to its travel, just as before it changes direction, which is the best time to do it. But like anything, the more you know a little bit about these things, the better they are. Now, another test that I like to do is, so I know the roller is outside the forks, and these clocks never, 100 times never turn the hand backwards, any. you'll. So what I want to touch on the minute hand. So if I turn that, you see the hour hand moving? So I know the clutch is free, and because it shouldn't be very stiff. Because if it gets too stiff, and I've seen that in one of mine, when I put the minute hand on, it was turning, but it was just slipping on the arbor, and the hour hand wasn't moving. And this was one of my first ones. And guess what I had to do? Take the clock all apart because I didn't check that, and to make sure. So I like to do as much as I can before I start taking things apart to know what the clock is doing and what it's not doing. So again, to adjust the time, what you do is you can set the time a couple minutes ahead and then unlock it when the actual real time catches up to the clock instead of trying to. Now, these things I said to, you can get them fairly accurate if you spend a lot of time. Now, any indication I got from reading was a minute a month, but the one that I did is much better than that because I spent the time. So that's checking the minute hand clutch. Now, the other thing that we want to do that would give an indication of something wrong is if the clock's in beat. So how do we know when an Atmos clock is in beat? When that roller, if we look at the roller, I may have a picture. I guess I don't. Might be a picture in this book. I think of these things as I'm talking about them, and instead of having them prepared. Anyway, when there's no power on the clock, and you usually put it in beat before you put the escapement on. So if you could imagine this clock, you see the roller is facing perfectly. Oh, here, I don't have to do that. I can do that. The roller is facing perfectly towards you, but it has to do that face to the front of the clock. Right now, I've got it locked. The roller is outside, and that's how you tell it's in beat. But you can't do it with the movement in there. But you can tell if it's out a lot by stopping, because it has to, and that's how you put the clock in beat. We'll be doing that during the actual service. Now, another thing that I'm going to move the camera. Okay, I'm going to unlock. Now, when you lock it, what you're doing is you're pushing a pin up from the bottom up and it pushes the ring that we're going to talk about. Okay, so here's the frame, and this is the ring fixed to the pendulum. And you see the space here and the space up here? It's very small, less than a millimeter. When you're putting the suspension spring and pendulum back in, there's a pin up on the top, and don't ever cut that extra suspension spring off. There's a pin up top, and you have to make sure that that spacing is very even. Today you can kind of see it. And you do that visually. And what you do is you have to tap on that pin. You unlock the screw with the pin, you tap it, and that's how you set the height of that suspension spring. So what you do, if that distance is off, you say, well, something happened my suspension spring. So that's another indication that you look at whether you need to dig really deep. So that first group, if you don't know the clock, what you're trying to do is determine whether or not you need to take the suspension spring out of its tube to actually check it for any kinks, because these clocks won't work if there's at least a little bit of kink or anything or twist in that suspension spring. It has to be perfectly flat its whole length. So that's what we did in all these first tests. We're trying to build up some data as to how deep we need to go in doing the service. Again, I'll point to these. See, there's a space here, and here's the space here. Yeah, it looks like the pendulum is speeding up and slowing down, but it's not. That's just my internet.
Wendell,
So, yes,
does that distance ever change on its own?
only if the suspension spring got damaged. You see, I just shook this thing. See how it moves around?
Yeah.
So when I lock it, what I'm doing is I'm pushing up from the bottom, and you see that go up?
Yes.
And so that's how you're locking it. You're forcing it, the pendulum, that ring up against the frame.
Okay.
The plates and the frame of the clock. So this one passed all those tests. I didn't see any indication that we needed to take the suspension spring out and look at it. But you never know with some of these clocks. Now the next thing, those close-ups come out pretty good, didn't they?
Very good.
Yeah, yeah, it looks good.
Better than the cell phone. So now what we're going to talk about is the 15-minute test. The 15-minute test is a way that if you change or if you wanted to check the clock. Now we can't do it here today because it literally takes 15 minutes. This clock, that pendulum has to rotate. This pendulum down here has to rotate exactly 30 seconds of rotation. So when you do it for 15 minutes, you're doing 30 full rotations, and somebody figured out a chart, and you use the good old stopwatch, but you have to be very precise because sometimes you're dealing with less than a second after 15 minutes. So this clock runs at 120 beats per hour, which isn't very fast. So what you're doing is if you watch, there's different ways you can do the timing. So if we unlock it here, now you can use, we'll just follow one. So I'm watching the roller, because if you watch the roller, you can see, okay, so it's coming around, it's coming into the floor. What I'm going to do is, you see the minute hand took a big jump there. So as soon as that jumped, I started it. So the minute hand won't move again until it comes back. I'm just going to do one full rotation too. So I'm going to be looking for the minute hand again.
There it goes.
Okay, you see what's that, about a fifth of a second out? But that's only 1 minute. So you have to do that for 15 minutes. And I do it multiple times because you have to make sure that you're exact. Because if you have to take that pendulum out, you only want to do it the once. It's not something that you want to be taking apart. So if the test, if you missed it, you have to have even numbers. So if you did 16 minutes, it wouldn't matter as long as it was even, or 18. It's just that the chart is finely calibrated for the 15 minutes. So you can kind of guesstimate a little bit. So you have to be very exact in your starting and stopping. I know it took me a little while to get it so that I was happy with my time. So I did it several times until I could repeat the same accuracy multiple times. So this chart, that ain't gonna work. Let me lock that clock. The poor clock is getting some miles on it today. Oh. I'm gonna. How am I gonna do this? I'll have to stop the share so I can do the overhead one. And I don't want that mirrored. Okay, so what we got here. So this is a chart, and this chart is out of that book. It's in different places. It's in some of those other notes that's put out. Okay, let me. I got to change the magnification on that. Too much. Okay. So this is a chart about the 15-minute test. So you have to make sure the clock is level, count the oscillations during the 15 minutes. And if the error exceeds plus or minus 1 second, so that's after 15 minutes, if it's more than 1 second on your stopwatch, and you want to verify that a number of times, then you have to load or unload weight on the pendulum. And those weights are always put in pairs because that pendulum is even perfectly balanced. So a guide is 1 millimeter thickness of that weight is equal to 7 seconds in 15 minutes. Now, they also have the screws and the studs in them to give you smaller amounts of adjustment, like 1 millimeter is 2 seconds and 15. So, and then if you check the error after 24 hours of run, and the error is less than 150 seconds, then the regulator up top will do the there's enough adjustment in it to do that. So the next chart, these charts are stuff that I've taken out of the book. Let me blow that up a little bit. So these are the errors for the 15 minutes test. So if we look at the first line, like 1 second error is 4 seconds an hour or 96 seconds a day. So it's 1.6 minutes a day error, which is what you can correct. Now the weight they give you, my thing is messing up so a 1 millimeter weight gives you 11.2 minutes a day, or a 1 millimeter stud. So that chart has got all those weights in it. It's a little bit more complicated sounding than what it really is. But so the next thing we want to do is visually check the bellows status, which we already did earlier. And we talked about the level bubble status to check, make sure the level bubble is still accurate. Okay, so now we're getting into some of the technical measurements. I need my clock back. Actually, it might be a page.
Can I ask a question, Dave?
Yeah, it's Wendell, but go ahead.
Wendell, I'm sorry. How often in all the Atmos clocks you've serviced have you had to change the weights on the pendulum?
I've only done 3 clocks, and I had to change them once because through lack of experience and nobody to talk to, I broke the suspension spring trying to put it back together. So I had to change the suspension spring, so that forced me to get into some heavy duty stuff. But it was a good learning experience, and I'm not sorry I did it.
Okay.
But it again, like, depending how these Atmos clocks are treated, like if people treat them like they're supposed to be treated and keep them locked, the suspension spring should never get hurt.
Right, correct.
But if you're out buying a used one, it's just like other clocks that you see, right?
You're right.
So when we're putting, okay, so I'm going to blow this up a little bit more. Okay, so if we look in the clock, I showed you the regulator pin before. Now the regulator pin has a narrow tip that goes down inside this part of the tube, and it has a wider part. When you put this clock back together, there should be 1 millimeter of that thick part of the clock sticking down. Now it's hard to show that because I didn't take enough of the clock apart. You need to take the face off, but we'll show that. But I just want to show you that measurement. That focus is pretty sensitive. The point of that is, so you can see it, the steel bar here, that's actually a spring bar that has the return for the timing. And you see this screw here, that screw is screwed right into that regulator pin. So that has to be one. Now, what I have, and that's when I showed you all those wires. There's my 1 millimeter, millimeter wire that I use. So I just roughly hold it in by the regulator to get, but you can kind of guesstimate a millimeter too. So that has to be set at 1 millimeter. And that gives you, the reason you're setting that, because that gives you maximum movement in both directions. If you had it way down in one direction, you're not going to get as much movement as you think you should have. So it's important to note when you're looking at a clock, because you don't know who might have worked on it, to make sure that that pin is in the 1 millimeter roughly spot. Because if you change the suspension spring, you have to reset that back. But if you're not changing the suspension spring, that should stay, it should be okay where it is. Now, the other setting is 1.75 millimeters, which is, I showed you that earlier. that's this gap. That gap right there. That has to be 1.75 millimeters. Now, there's a thing up top called the castle nut. Let me see if I can get a better picture. Oh, here's a better picture of the yeah, you can, there's a better picture. You can see the regulator pin and you can see the thick part. There's a narrow part that goes down inside the tube and that thick part, but you lock that in with this screw. Like all this stuff has a locking screw. So that's the regulator pin setting up. Now the other piece that okay, here you can see here, if you look here, you'll see the castle nut. Because that lever only moves probably 70 degrees, the lever on the top. Do I have a picture of that? Anyway, the lever only moves so far, but there's more thread, so you can hold that castle nut. And I made this tool because it doesn't come in the kit, and I don't know why, but this is a tool. So what I would do is I'd put it in those two pins and hold it, and then slide the regulator back, the arm, not the regulator, but the adjustment arm. I'd slide it back, and then that gives me another full swing. So you have to be watching, and it's important to watch that gap. This gap here, this is the gap here. Yeah, so this is the gap, and you'll see it, and we'll see it when we take it apart. When you can see that gap there opens and closes as you're moving that arm. So if you change the suspension spring, you need to put that back into the middle setting, which is 1.75 millimeters. And again, I have another brass rod that I can hold it. I can probably show you that. Let me get the clock back. Yeah, I think I can show that to you. Now I got to go through my settings. Okay, so I got to share this again. My iPad. I'll have to find a way to turn off the going to sleep part for doing these things. Okay. So if you go my mouse, I move that out of the way. Okay, so if you look here, you'll see the thick part of the regulator. Now that's more than a millimeter because I've been adjusting the clock to time it. But if you put a new suspension spring in, you have to put that back to the mid-range, which is 1 millimeter down from that spring when you set it up. But before you do that, you want to, and there's the gap here on the castle nut. And again, it wouldn't be 1.75 millimeters now because it's, I don't know if we can. Yeah, you can kind of see the gap. It's right in here. But that's why when you replace the suspension spring, you have to set all these things, these two adjustments back to the midpoint to give you a starting point for adjusting so that you make sure you have maximum travel in the okay. Okay, so I had mentioned this earlier, but I'll say it again. So there's two time regulation methods in an Atmos clock. You change the weights of the pendulum. You add or decrease depending on what you want to do. And then you have the you can see the regulation up on the top up here. Each one of those divisions is 10 seconds per day. And then back here, you can see the castle nut that and here's the pin that holds the suspension spring in place. And this is the screw that locks it. And you see, I have a perfectly nice straight piece of I'll show it closer, of suspension spring. You see, it's probably 1.5 inches long, because when you poison it, you have to grab a hold of the end, and sometimes you might have to nip off a few millimeters because it's got a kink in it. It can't be kinked. It has to be perfectly straight to get it back up through the tube. Okay, so the other thing that we need to do is when we let down the power, that barrel, and usually what I do this is the spring barrel here. Usually I put a piece of tape here. I don't want to mark it. I put a little piece of masking tape, usually the painter's tape that has less glue. And then you have to let it down manually to unload it. You can't put a clamp on it. And that should have between 5 and 7 rotations, that spring barrel, because you have to know that. So when you put it back together, you put the exact same amount of tension back in it. And you do that by pumping this spring in the back. So that's 5 to 7. The other thing that I like to do is after I service the clock, because remember I said it should run around 18, I may start it up so that it's only running maybe 13, 14, and see over a day or two whether it's increasing, because then that tells me that it's good power getting to the escape wheel, if it's got enough power to increase the and just like a 400-day clock, I like to see that roller. I see I locked it with the roller in the, I got to unlock it. The roller's in the suspension, which it shouldn't have been. I want to get that out. There, it's out. So I like to see and just physically look to see that it's rotating roughly the same amount of degrees to the left and to the right after I service it. Okay, those are all the tests. Now I have a whole bunch of little statements that I come across. So any questions on any of that, on those adjustments? Okay.
So, sorry.
Okay.
Where's,
Go ahead.
Where's the click? Where's the click to let down the mainspring?
Let it down.
Let the power down.
The locks it is right here, and you can see the ratchet, but you don't let it down that way. What you have to do is hold it. You hold this gear while you take the movement off, which we're going to do. So you'll actually see that demonstrated, and then you manually let it down.
Yeah, so it's very different. Thank you. Yeah.
There is no thing like a clock where you put it on the winding arbor, because this clock has no winding arbor. So you can't do it that way. And see, this click, the whole click mechanism is so fine. And you just look at how many teeth. See, you just look at how close the teeth are. So, because there's very little bit of movement in that bellows at certain times, so it has to move enough to ratchet one tooth. Okay, again, to repeat, if you're adjusting the time or moving the clock, it's a good idea to lock it at its maximum swing. That way you can't do any damage to the suspension spring or the escapement. Because this clock is considered the most delicate clock ever made. Very, very unforgiving. Now these service booklets, I'm going to move the clock again. I showed you the one service booklet. I showed you the CD. Now, I got to stop the share, I guess. Well, actually, in this book, it has all those on the section. Like you'll see all the it has two different ones. There's the first one, and this is for the Atmos 6 528, which is a slightly different version in how they adjust the time, but it's still a 528. Now that other one I showed you, it's an Atmos 6, but that's the same one. Anyway, there's three of them. They're in. All you need is in that book if you're so inclined. So this is the yeah. I guess on that CD there was one called Heritage, but it's the same basic stuff. And you see, I've been going through highlighting. Let me lower the magnification. See, I've been going through highlighting different things, but it has like parts lists. And then there's another one written by some firm in New York. So those are good for the fine technical settings and numbers, but they're not really good in giving you a step-by-step of what to do. This clock, again, needs 24 hours of settling time for adjustments. The amount of pendulum rotation should be between 500 and 540 degrees. For the 528, each one of those motors are 30 degrees. There's 12 of them on it, so it should be around 18. Now the 519, they're 36 degrees. Again, we talked about beat, putting it in beat, which we'll actually demonstrate when we take it apart. The clock hands always clockwise, never counterclockwise, because you'll damage. Hand poising, when we take it apart, we'll check the poise on both the hour hand and the minute hand. a badly poised minute hand will stop the clock, and a badly poised hour hand will cause it to lose up to a quarter of amplitude in the pendulum rotation. The castle nut gap centering is 1.75 millimeters. The regulator pin is 1 millimeter. We just went over that. There's a thing called overbanking. Sometimes it might rotate so much that it goes around and hits the outside of the fork. It can't get in it because it's over rotated too far. There's not a lot of information on that. I do have a little bit of stuff that I'll talk about on overbanking, on what you might do, but you want to hope you never have to do it. Now, the roller clearance, the clearance of the roller going in the fork, that should be on. Let's see if there's I don't see a picture of that. So here it is. Okay, let me magnify that baby up some. Okay, so here is the measurement for that. 0.15 to 0.25 millimeters. Now, most of this stuff should never get, unless somebody damaged it, it should never get out of whack. And the same thing, the heights, this is the fork and this is the roller, those heights in these notes, all that technical, and then the all that stuff on the top, they give you the measurements for what that should be doing. There's the regulator, and they talk about the tools there. So, and again, leave that suspension spring sticking out the top. You don't want to do anything to hurt that. Now, overbanking solutions, I talked to different people, tried reading everything I could find about. There's not much, but people did suggest a couple solutions that might solve the problem. And they sort of make sense. The forks can be widened, which is going to lessen, but I had somebody tell me that could be 5 to 10 times the width of the spacing that's already there, and I can't see myself bending it that much. Another thing would be is that because these are third-party suspension springs, they're not made by Le Coulter. You might try a different suspension spring. That one could be just off a little bit. And the third thing was that the mainspring could be wound too tight. Other than that, there wasn't much information. Now, pendulum ring spacing, we talked about that. Pendulum arm orientation. The help, when we put the clock back together, now I got to go back to my other camera. This may be a good system, but it's slow. Share. Okay, so annotate mouse. This is this arm here and an arm here. When you take that pendulum all apart, and it's fairly easy to tell which way the suspension spring is laying, because if you hold it up against light, you can see it shine. So those arms should be at right angles or at parallel to the suspension spring. So the flatted suspension spring should follow those two arms on the pendulum. Now, I'll unlock that so you can actually see the arms. You see the arm come out? Because what that does is that helps you put it in beat. The same thing when you're putting the roller assembly on the top. If you put it on close to the right, which we'll be doing when we take it apart, and then that helps you get it in beat much easier. Because to put it in beat, this screw and this spring here, that acts as a shock, so that this roller is sitting on a needle point that you can't take that out. It's sitting on a needle point and has to roll very, very easily. And that whole part here is mounted on that spring, which acts like a shock. And this screw holds all that onto the tube. You put a very little bit of down pressure on it to hold that. So if this happens to hit the back side of those arms, this spring will give and you won't bend anything or break anything. So it makes it easier when you're putting it together. Poising the pendulum tube. I have a picture in one of those notes. They actually show, maybe I can, yeah, so you can see, you see this arm, you screw it, so you're actually bending this tube, because you can see up top here where you're hanging it I would hang it by the very end, and the regulator is down inside, so that has to hang perfectly still, because you don't want the regulator rubbing on the top of the tube. So you actually have to bend this tube. Again, that only comes into play if you're replacing the suspension spring or if it got dropped or damaged somehow. But that's the tool, and it was in that kit. You can buy that tool separate. And see there, you can actually see the regulator. If you look here, and they demonstrate it where it's rubbing on the side before it gets poised.
So you pretty well need that kit.
Yeah, you can buy the 3 critical pieces, and it's about half the price of buying the whole kit.
Yeah.
Life's not easy. Okay, here they show poison the escapement. You actually hang it upside down. I've got a little, I use a pair of tweezers with a spacer in them, and it's actually sitting on the 2 pivots. And these arms you have to actually bend to counteract the weight. That has to hang perfectly straight up and down.
Okay.
And we're actually going to do that. That's why I keep repeating this. This clock is very unforgiving. We already did the Bellows check. Now the coil spring in the back of this clock. So when we let the power down, this distance, where is the clock? There. So when you measure that distance, actually from the plate, right now that's about 25 millimeters. But when the spring is, the timing spring, when it's fully let down, it should be 47 millimeters. And that regulates how much the clock will actually wind up when you're winding it, so that it doesn't get overwhelmed. And how you adjust that is the chain links. There's usually 6 or 7 chain links, and that chain has to be perfectly flat, no twists as it's going around all the wheels. It has to lay perfectly flat. In the movement, the place you put the oil is on the spring barrel and on the second wheel, because they're not in joules. So you're going to put so at this pivot here and this pivot here, and then on the spring barrel, but the slightest amount of oil. And everything else runs dry. Everything is perfectly polished and running in joules, because it's a long running clock and oil dries out after 3 to 5 years. If you oiled it, you'd be taking it apart every few years, because these don't have any power to overcome friction of dry oil.
Hmm.
And when you, yes?
We got 20 minutes left. So, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, we're almost done. And when you clean the movement, the jewels have to be perfectly shiny, and the pivots, I usually just wipe off the pivots because there's nothing there really for them to get crusted with old oil and whatnot, but everything has to be clean. Now, we talked about timing weights. So roughly it's 5 minutes for each 0.5 millimeter thickness. Now, the timing weights that I have, I actually had to replace some. I bought these. I got some millimeter and 0.5 millimeter thick. You get different thickness ones, and that so that they will fit. So that's the end, I think, of the theory part. So the next Zoom, we're going to be doing my the next Zoom, we're going to be actually dismantling the movement. Again, there'll be 3 things that we won't be doing. But if anybody needed advice on actually if they had to do it 2 o'clock, like I'm not against doing a separate Zoom. The trouble is I wouldn't have a clock to take apart, because you just don't take these clocks apart for the fun of it. I guess in this instance, I'm taking this one apart, but it's a high risk thing to take it apart when there's nothing wrong with it. So we're going to dismantle it. We won't be taking the suspension spring out. We won't be taking the spring out. What was the other thing that we wouldn't be doing? We won't be taking the movement apart, but we will be taking the escapement out so I can demonstrate the Poising. So I've got a lot of notes that I'm going to follow through when we're taking it apart, and I'll be repeating all those measurements and everything. And then we'll actually talk about cleaning it, and then we'll actually assemble it back together. And that's where you have to have all those measurements and put it in poise and all that. So we've got a few minutes left for any questions that people would have.
When you say, Wendell, that you take it apart, how do you clean it without taking it apart? How do you clean the jewels? I've done a few.
Yeah, you have to take it apart.
Yeah.
But because of our 2-hour time limit, I cannot take everything apart.
I understand. Okay, thank you.
No, you have to literally take it apart, but my goal is to show you the parts where you can get into a lot of trouble. So I'm taking enough of that apart to show you how to do that.
Great.
Let me
Ed's got a
change my
question.
video.
Yes, I have a question. The the rotation of the pendulum is supposed to be 340 degrees or 540?
540.
500.
Well, they say between 500 and 540 degrees.
For all model or?
As I said in the beginning, any information I'm giving you today, I've verified that it works for the 526 and the 528.
520.
Now, there is a 519, and I had one. They're from back in the 50s. There's some slightly different measurements, like in the gap for the castle nut and stuff like that. But what we're talking about today is the 526 and the 528, which are the most common. Now, the 540, which is a newer one, I think they come out in 1983 or 1984. The movement is quite a bit different. So again, now they do discuss some of that stuff in the book, if you buy that book about the 540. But
Okay.
again, this is the 526 and the 528.
Okay. I don't understand, because when we look the ruler is supposed to make 540 degrees. He make about two turns.
Well, 2 turns would be seven.
Not two turns, but one more. Okay.
1.5 for sure.
One and a half.
Yeah.
1.5. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, mine clock only do 340 degrees.
Yeah, and how you verify your rotation is set the clock up, make sure it's level, and have it settle for 24 hours at least, and then count how many motifs pass. Now, a lot of clocks, like some of my clocks, only run 14 and 15 before I cleaned them. But after cleaning, they run 18 and 19.
Okay.
If they run 21, you're in trouble, because 21 will overbank and it will actually go around far enough to hit the outside of the wrong fork.
Right, right.
So it that's called overbanking.
Okay. Thank you.
Wendell, where do you purchase the new canisters? Like, I know I've heard some are gas filled and they're 3 months warranty and they just don't work out. And the cost of buying a new Bellows is out of the world.
Yeah, it's between $500 and $700 to get a
Right.
replacement. That's why, like, I went out of my way to tell you, if you're looking at buying one, you can visually check the canister, unless they'll let you take the 2 nuts off to take it off and measure it. But if you see all chain on the 528,
Right.
then it's a good idea that the canister is still good.
Right. Well,
I also said that if you send your canister away to get repaired,
yeah.
that most places will give you a 6-month warranty. But if you wound the clock up properly when you put it back together, it's going to run for a year, so you'll never
Right.
know. So,
Yeah.
And that's why these people, now in this book, there's 5 or 6 people listed that actually service Atmos clocks. These people buy every old clock they can get, because not every canister leaks. So that, they need parts.
Right.
So that's where they're getting them.
Oh,
Now, I don't know whether if you look on eBay, there's a lot of canisters and Bellows, a lot of that stuff, a lot of different parts. They're all used as far as I know. But it would be something. But I guess me personally, I wouldn't touch one that had a busted canister unless you got it for $100. Because the minute arbor, if you ever broke one, like, you would have those parts. But now you can run the clock without the bellows and canister on it.
right. Yeah.
You can just pump it up, and it's going to run for a long time without it. Like, you might come across another clock sometime where you could actually get now the one that I bought, I paid $75 for a number of years ago.
Wow.
I bought it with a bunch of other stuff because I always wanted an Atmos clock. Well, this particular person had an Atmos clock, but he wouldn't sell it. But he said, I got a Bellows here, a new one, still in the.
Wow.
So he sold it. And I had it, and then all of a sudden I bought a clock, and the Bellows was bad. So
Ed, did you have a question?
Yes, yeah, I did. Thank you very much. Thank you, Wendell. Very nice presentation. Appreciate your time. I just have a quick question with regards to some of the tools in the kit. I know in the book, I do have the book about the Atmos clock, and they did mention 2 specific tools. Unfortunately, the photos is just a drawing and not very clear on how they look like. With regards to the suspension spring, they call it a threading tool that you put it on top of the suspension spring in order for the spring to go through. So did you have that specific tool, and would it be possible to maybe share some photos of that particular tool? So because I don't know, I haven't been able to see any of that particular tool anywhere online, or I don't know if it's part of that kit. Thank you.
okay, I'm going to go to share again. Okay, that's the tool I think you're talking about. And this is actually a hypodermic needle, I think. These kits, somebody in the US are making these kits for time savers. It's a 2-0 needle, and instead of being pointed, it's flat on the end.
Okay.
So when you put that in through the top, when you're putting it back in, oh, what did they do? See, I don't know what I did here. Okay, let me bring this back over. So when you're putting it in, this goes down through the top, and then you have to fit the suspension spring. That's where I broke it. You can compare the size of the hole to the suspension spring.
Right.
They're pretty tiny, but that you can actually is a needle that because somebody in the US is crafting these for time savers. Because if you get on and buy the official kit,
Right.
You're probably looking at $1,000.
Right.
But
so those needles, do you have the diameter of that specific tube or needle that they have there, or what is it about? Maybe a 1 millimeter diameter?
Well, I can actually measure the OD because I have my calipers right here.
Thank you.
Mm. 0.89 OD, but it's a 2-0 needle. Needles have a gauge number on them. I don't know what that means, but
so it's 0.89, yeah, 0.89 millimeter. Perfect. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
No, I go to the veterinary clinic and buy needles because when I'm gluing clocks or doing woodworking, I use these small needles to get glue into cracks. So, but you can get them really big or you can get them small. So,
right.
The best thing to do would be to get a piece of suspension spring and just go and see what fits in.
Right. Right. Exactly. So I think that's a good idea, just to get something that fits the suspension spring and the hole so you can easily feed it through. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of literature on Atmos clock, so I really appreciate the fact that you're taking the time to show us these things.
Look, there is none. And I've spent a couple years investigating. Some people wouldn't talk to me. Some people, they just don't want to give away the information. So this is all, and I have enough information that I was able to do my 3 clocks without any difficulty. Now, I did break the first suspension spring because I was experimenting and I didn't have anybody to reference to or to talk to. So at least now we have something. And as we tear this one apart, we'll actually be going over, because we won't have to cover all this theory now because we've already done that. So we'll have 2 hours to take it apart and put it back together and set it up. Is there any more quick questions before we?
I have one more, Wendell. How do you get the minute hand off without breaking it? The first one I broke, even
Yep.
with a hand puller. Is there a key to get it off without breaking it?
No, this is the puller. You have to be very steady. I haven't broken it yet, and some of them are on pretty tight.
Yes,
But-
yes,
That's one of the key things. You have to have this puller to get, and the stud that goes in the puller has to fit the size of the hole in the hand. And
right.
you cannot treat this clock like a regular clock. I'll repeat it again for the millionth time. This clock is very unforgiving. It's, there's no midway between. You either do it right or you break it.
Yeah. Thank
But
you.
It's unfortunate that you're going to invest $500 Canadian to get started to work on Atmos clocks.
There are very few people that service them now, right?
Yeah, because people don't understand them or don't want to invest that kind of money.
That's right.
But like that charging, $500 to $1,000 to service them.
And that's low.
Yeah, there's
Okay, well, Wendell, thank you very much on behalf of the Ottawa Valley Watch and Clock Collectors Club. Thank you for your time and your expertise. And we're going to be recording this. Well, we have been recording it. We're going to have it up on YouTube, and the links to it will be on the webpage for everybody to basically get to it.
Thank
Hi,
you
is there
very
a
much,
minute?
Wendell.
Hi, is there a
Okay.
minute for me? Hello, is there a minute for me to say?
Sure.
Okay, I have I've had a good experience sending Bellows to get recharged to the States. I sent them to Jeffrey Kitts in Eagle River, Wyoming. Okay, I don't know, can you see that information there? Does it show up or no?
no.
It's off the screen.
So how much warranty does he give?
When I had mine done, he said a year, but it's been a
Okay.
couple years since I had any done. I've had 2 done and they had good results, but
Yeah.
just keep in mind that by the time you work in all the exchange and insurance and there's duty when it comes back, he charges $100 US plus shipping and insurance. So you're probably looking at about $250, between $200 and $250 Canadian.
Yeah, well, that's not bad. So
Yeah.
if you were gonna get one repaired and you watch that chain over months, and then you can make sure that it's still working after 11 months before the year is up to know whether you need to send it back.
That's right. I also have a contact in chapter 33 in Toronto. He does a lot of Atmos repairs and he carries a lot of parts.
Okay.
Anybody know or heard of a guy's name, Gabor, Gabor? Chapter 33. I can give you his phone number. It's a cell number and he doesn't mind having having customers refer to him.
Yes. Is it John? Is it your name, Mr. Vanilla?
No, it's actually Jose Rodolfo. I go by Rudy.
Jose? Okay, so can I get your email address and I'll get that information from you?
Okay, it's JR.
Mm-hmm.
And just like it shows up on my name, JR Bonilla @simpatico.ca.
Okay, great. I'll send you an email and then I'll collect that information from you so everybody has it. We'll put a slide up on the video board.
Okay, sounds
Great.
good. Thank you very
Okay.
much for putting this together.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Thank
bye.
you.
Bye.